With regards to the toolkit, many of you have indicated that you have already looked online and used some of the tools. For those of you who have not, this is the address, un-innovation.tools/register, and this also is available and open to anybody within the system, anybody who is working for the United Nations, and in fact, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it's also open for anybody outside the system. It was developed as a common good. However, the tools and the case studies that are incorporated in there do have a UN focus, and they were developed in collaboration with a large number of UN entities and agencies. Johanna indicating at the start there her involvement in the design of the toolkit and that of the UN Innovation Network as a whole, and obviously coming up with these tools which have these case studies incorporated in them as a first engagement around innovation and how this can work within the United Nations. Of course, a lot of the discussion around how to incorporate these tools into our daily use in the United Nations involves contextualization, and really working out how do we scope to what is doable within our team, our unit, and our organization. And so that leads me to a discussion around the online diagnostic tool, which is the first element of engagement with the toolkit. When you do register, it allows you, it is 27 questions, which allow you to start having a conversation, whether it be with yourself or whether it be with your team or your unit, not only on what does innovation mean to us, but also what scope is there for us to be innovative, to be more innovative within our own realities, and how do we bring that to a level where we can affect change, where we can affect transition, and where we can start to track the interventions that we make. And so I really would encourage you to engage with the online diagnostic tool. And in addition, one of the great features of the toolkit is the fact that it saves your response, it saves the results of your diagnostic so that you are able to sample an intervention, and then come back, undertake the diagnostic again, and see how that has changed. Now, of course, there will be successes and there will be failures, which leads us into today's session very, very nicely. As outlined by Johanna, the toolkit is separated into these 5 foundational pillars of innovation: strategy, partnerships, architecture, culture, and evaluation. Formula's wonderful acronym SPACE, which outlines why we have astronauts and rockets and all these sorts of lovely things. This series of presentations, which again, thank you to Johanna and UNIN at large for the invitation to undertake this, has seen us deliver presentations on strategy, where we looked at the Innovation Planner tool, on partnerships, where we discussed how to define a value proposition, and then just last week examining architecture, where we looked at user-centered design. Now, all of those presentations are available on the UNIN website, at least, and then of course all of those tools are available as part of the Innovation Toolkit, freely available to anyone within the system and even without. Now, today we are going to be looking at culture, and I have to stress, I absolutely agree with Johanna in her discussion or her framing of a culture of evaluation as being one of the most critical elements for innovation. I absolutely agree. It's trying to work out how can we allow our teams and our units to start discussing, to start scoping, to start thinking, to start having conversations around what innovation is and how it can be useful for us. How can we work differently? How can we work to do different things? And it's having a space to allow that to happen, which is critical for innovation. So this idea of a culture, an enabling culture, is critical for this. And within the toolkit, as you will see, there are 4 tools: embracing failures, creating incentives and opportunities, defining strategic risks, and engaging governing bodies, which provide you tools so that you are able to once again have these conversations within your team, within your unit, where possible, within your agency or your entity, perhaps even across agencies and entities as well. But you will see here that this is the structure is such that it allows you to scope. when we're thinking about embracing failures, that can be done within our own team, the discussion to have that within our team. When we think about creating incentives and opportunities, a lot of times what we see in regards to pushback around how can we incorporate innovation more into our daily life is this discussion around how do we make people do this? How do we encourage people to have these discussions when we are all so busy, when we are all exposed to all of the work that is required in the United Nations. And this discussion around creating incentives and opportunities is critical because it doesn't focus solely on financial incentives. How do we incorporate incentives into the discussions that we are having that will allow people to feel freer to discuss, to engage, and to start thinking about doing things differently and doing different things. Defining strategic risks, of course, critical when we are engaging up, when we are managing up and trying to get permission to get allowances to work more innovatively, and then engaging governing bodies as well. Tools, strategies, and case studies as to how do we start having conversations with decision makers so that we can get them also on board for the innovative practices that we are looking to incorporate and looking to develop. Today we'll be looking at the Embrace Failures tool. Now the reason that we are going to be looking at that is twofold. One, it is the most recommended tool by the diagnostic within the culture module of the toolkit. So it has been identified as being relevant for the largest number of people, but also it is critical, of course, for simply having conversations around innovation. Now, when we talk about embracing failure, we need to understand that we're not talking about starting off aiming to fail, but simply understanding that sometimes innovative ideas will fail, and we need to, instead of sweeping those under the carpet or incorporating them on the 16th page of a report and then slipping it into a drawer never to be seen again, we actually work to understand how did that happen, why did that happen, and what can we do in the future to stop it from happening again. When we think about culture, organizations that truly hope to embed innovation into their DNA must create a culture that provides employees with the skills, opportunities, and incentives to innovate. I think this is very clear. However, what is less clear or less accepted by a number of particularly decision makers is that innovation inherently involves risk-taking. Failure will happen, as will success, but when failure does happen, as I say, it can't be ignored, it must be examined, it must be documented, it must, to a certain extent, almost be celebrated as, hey, look, we tried something new, let's see this as an opportunity to learn. One of those very annoying things that you will hear from trainers such as myself, my background is in instructional design and adult learning, is that FAIL stands for first attempt in learning. So there's going to be a number of acronyms around there which are just as cheesy, but they really do have a note of truth in them, and we really do need to work more as organizations, as entities, even as teams and units, on how can we learn more from failure, how can we allow ourselves to discuss failure in a broader context. Employees must understand the circumstances under which they are able to take risks and how to capture learning throughout the process, even when results are considered failure. So this is two elements. I mean, we're talking about enabling environments as well. There are tools around that in the toolkit. So we're talking about how we can allow our people to understand what risks they are able to take, but also critically, how do we capture learning? When do we capture learning? Are we incorporating this into the design of our projects from the start point, or are we simply trying to build that back onto projects that have failed, where we may be missing how decisions were made, how planning was implemented? Why did we think we were going to get to a certain position or juncture and we did not? Employees must also be able to effectively engage governing bodies and communicate innovation activities in a manner that resonates with potentially risk-averse groups. I don't think we need to name names, both within and outside their organization. This is critical because we're talking not only about allowing our teams and our units to work to engage innovation and engage failure, but we're also coupling this with how do we communicate better? How do we communicate better within teams and units so that we are able to discuss how far we're able to go? What does failure look like, and how can we incorporate that into our planning and our decision making? But also, how do we communicate up? How do we communicate with stakeholders to highlight the fact that we are pushing, highlight the fact that we are learning, highlight the fact that we are working to iterate, we're working to work differently and to do different things. So I think this is a critical starting point for us. And in a related discussion, you will see here that we have the Embrace Failures tool that we'll be discussing today, but within that tool are also recommended other tools that will assist you in this process. Now, this is not something that they don't need to be taken together. There is not an arc of learning throughout the toolkit. Each of the tools is designed so that it is able to be used individually and able to be used as itself. It has all of the steps outlined, which I'll be going through in a moment. But it also does highlight the fact that the tools incorporate similar elements, incorporate the same language, and incorporate planning that you are able to put in where you see weaknesses. So for example, if you have decided that embracing failures is important within your team, the creating incentives and opportunities will allow you to understand or to outline opportunities for you to incorporate this within your teams, to encourage people within your teams or your units. Similarly, innovation storytelling, which is part of the evaluation element of the toolkit, will allow you insight into processes and activities that you can undertake to better communicate what you are doing, and in particular, communicate failure perhaps when we are in risk-averse entities. So embracing failures helps users at all levels of an organization foster a culture where innovation failures are celebrated, are discussed openly, and are used to drive learning that accelerates innovation efforts. And this is critical. We need to be thinking about how we are driving learning within our agencies or our entities. It's not just failing. It's not failing for the sake of failing, but it's failing, stopping, recognizing that, and then learning. What went wrong in our planning? What went wrong in our processes? Why did we think that would succeed? How do we work to identify how we can stop that happening in the future? How can we share this information at a unit, a team, an organization, a cross entity, a stakeholder level, so that we are able to avert this from happening in the future? The tool itself incorporates 3 critical steps. Firstly, to consider the specific types of failure in innovation for learning purposes. The second, to establish a framework and the timing to document these lessons learned. And thirdly, to identify methods for sharing the lessons. How do we communicate these lessons, and how do we target that communication to our internal stakeholders, to our external stakeholders? Are we managing up? Are we sharing across organizations or entities? Because of course, the way that we communicate that is going to be different for each of those entities. To look at step 1, we need to consider the specific types of failure in innovation for learning purposes. So we need to think about what types of failure are there. Now there's an infographic coming up in the next slide, but the types of failure that are outlined in this tool are firstly, simple errors. I think we've all been victims of those. We've all done those in the past. We have what's called aha moments. Now these aha moments are where we've implemented an innovative activity whereby the steps were right, but the outcome was not what we had expected. So we need to stand back and we say, well, why was the outcome different to those that we had planned? Another aha moment is flipped a little bit, whereby the problem is addressed, the problem that we have identified is addressed, and when we start looking at the impact of that, we can see that perhaps there were differing issues, differing problems, or underlying problems that have not been addressed. And so we need to come back and think about our baselines, think about the assumptions that were made in our planning and our engagement activities. The third level is calculated risks. The fourth is bold failures. Now, these idea of bold failures, I'll go into this a little bit more on the next slide, are usually expected and are considered a positive. Now this, I accept that the font is a little hard to read. I've made it as big as I was brave enough to do. But if we have a look here on this types of innovation failures graph, we have here the relative opportunity for learning on this axis And then along the bottom here, we have the anticipated level of risk. So where both are low is where we've got simple errors. So this is careless, avoidable mistakes. Again, we've all done them. We've all been victims of them. We move on. Where we have a high level of risk and a relatively low opportunity for learning, this is experiments which fail due to unlikely but known risks. So we can identify the risks. We can judge whether we are comfortable with embarking on this process, and then we go ahead. If it fails, we understand generally why it fails. If we have a low anticipated level of risk, there is a higher level of learning at this area, which is the aha moments. So these are mistakes that are not expected and pose significant opportunities for learning and reflection. So again, whereby we've enacted something and the outcome was not what we expected, that is a chance for us to step back and analyze, for example. And then if we have a high anticipated level of risk, where there is really a great opportunity for learning, is these bold failures that occur when trying something completely new without an existing roadmap for success. And this is where failure is perhaps a little bit more expected, but then also when we're planning this, we need to understand where are we going to check in on this so that we can analyze success or failure. The second step in the tool is establishing a framework and timing to document the lessons learned. This is where within the toolkit you have a downloadable worksheet, which is the Innovation Checkpoint worksheet. You're able to document lessons learned throughout the innovation lifecycle from ideation to scale. Now this is critical, incorporating these checkpoints throughout the entire lifecycle of the process. All too often, we're really only looking at success or failure at the end of a project or an innovation intervention, whereby we need to be bringing that right back to the start point as well and incorporating these regular check-ins. And this document, this worksheet, will assist you in doing that. We need to think about the frequency of our checkpoints. What is the scope of this innovation? How long is this innovation? If it's a 6-week process, then perhaps we can build in shorter term check-ins. If it's a year-long process, when is it that we need to be necessarily looking at those check-ins, and how does that tie into our communication strategy? Similarly, also dependent upon the complexity, perhaps the number of stakeholders, the number of partnerships of any innovation intervention, we would need to bring back and really start to think about and communicate how often we are going to be checking in on success or failure. Now, I'm going to bring in what are called the action outlines, which are incorporated into the tool itself. Now, these action outlines are essentially case studies, fictional case studies that are incorporated into the toolkit. In this one, I mean, sometimes they are real case studies as well, but this one here, to reduce roadside fatalities involving motorcycle taxis in Kenya, a team implemented a new program that provides drivers with lightweight, durable, and low-cost helmets for their passengers. The team decided to conduct a 5-month pilot of the innovation in Nairobi and document the lessons learned. Now, this is the basis that you will see in the worksheet that is available online. So this is our innovation checkpoint. You've got the name of the project, which you'll be incorporating with your teams. You've got a description of the innovation project, and you'll see here really briefly describing what this is, really working with your teams and your units to drill down to what is the exact scope, the focused scope of this innovation intervention. And then we start asking, well, what failed? But critically also what worked, because we need to be iterating this. So we're not just focused on failure, just like we're not just focused on success. We're bringing in each of these elements. So here we can see that the project was to develop cost-effective helmets to be given to motorcycle taxi drivers who would then be able to share them with their passengers in an effort to curb fatalities. One of the failures that they indicate is that there are a large number of differing users of these taxi motorcycles, perhaps even children, whereby the helmet would not fit. However, what worked, they've been successful in navigating partnerships and procurement processes. And so you can immediately see, just from those two elements of feedback there needs to be more focus and more change here, which they've indicated here, working with our partner to build a one-size-fits-all helmet and exploring schemes to provide helmets directly to passengers. But then from the what worked element, we can see that, in fact, our communication was pretty good, but there were some elements we can change there. So it's trying to identify what are some of the quick wins, what are some of the low-hanging fruit that we can celebrate as a team, we can share with our partners, we can share as we manage up, but also what are some of the interventions that we're going to have to incorporate. Then here, an innovation review report, whether this was a success or a failure, what type of failure, and then also some of the reasons and the key takeaways, which can then be shared on a unit level and shared with partners, depending on how ready those partners are to engage around this type of communication. Which leads into this third element of the process, identifying methods for sharing lessons learned. So we need to understand, as I said at the start of the session, the communication methods will differ. If this is simply within your unit, you're going to have to work out how you can share this information to that level. If it's across agencies, we need to be working out how we're going to share that, what is going to be incorporated into this report. If it's with partners, if it's with internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, if we're looking to manage up, if we're engaging with governing bodies, we need to be thinking about how is this being communicated and what is being communicated for the most impact for that stakeholder or for that partner. Similarly, we need to be thinking about the alignment of our reporting with a level of failure acceptance. So if we have an organization that is comfortable with failure and has an enabling environment to encourage this, then perhaps we incorporate this reporting into a principles document to share across so that people can learn from this. If we're in a more risk-averse environment, perhaps something such as a Failure Fridays engagement, which is just whereby you can invite people to attend online or, if possible, face-to-face, not quite likely at this time, but perhaps online in a smaller group, just to say, hey, this is what we did, this is the reasons that we feel that we failed, these were some of the successes, and this is what we're going to be looking to amend in the future. So really thinking about the scope of communication and the scope of sharing. Now, this is also incorporated in your toolkit. This is part of the downloadable tool. And you can see here, if we're in an organization that is less accepting of failure, then perhaps we're looking at something like this Failure Fridays, which brings people together. UNICEF holds this regularly. And then as we move further and further across to the right here, to where we're perhaps in an organization that sees failure as a metric, failure as something that really should be measured and should be incorporated in an organization-wide sphere, organization-wide approach. You've got some ways in which you can start to communicate this across your agencies and across your entities. And again, you can see here that there are a number of agencies which are undertaking this. There are case studies, and then here at the bottom here, you can see here, as I've mentioned earlier on, creating incentives and opportunities, in fact, as a tool within the toolkit that you are able to access and use to flesh out some of these engagements and some of this planning that you are undertaking. The case study that is incorporated into your toolkit, into this tool, is the SDG Lab Failure Report. The SDG Lab is a multifunctional, multi-stakeholder initiative based in Geneva, and I would encourage you to download the tool and read the case study as to how they have worked to incorporate embracing failures as a strategic tool and also as a communication tool. The email address, Johanna has my email address. I think it's at the end of this presentation as well, but I am also available at innovation@unssc.org. And once again, the address for the toolkit is un-innovation.tools/register. I would encourage you to engage with that. I understand that we are at 4 o'clock. That is half an hour. I am happy to stick around for any questions and answers that you may have. Obviously, I am available via email also if you wish. Thank you.